19 days. That is how long it took a Canadian Special Operations Task Force, operating in a theater they had never formally planned for, attached to an American headquarters that had not requested them, to produce intelligence results that senior U.S. commanders would later describe as operationally irreplaceable. 19 days, fewer than 3 weeks, inside a conflict that had already consumed 4 years, billions of dollars, and thousands of lives. The year is 2003. The dust from the initial invasion of Iraq has not yet settled. The coalition's confidence is still high enough to be embarrassing in retrospect. American Special Operations Forces are spread thin across a country the size of France, simultaneously hunting regime remnants, securing weapons sites, and trying to make sense of an insurgency that is metastasizing faster than any pre-war model predicted. U.S. Central Command is managing a theater involving 130,000 personnel, $4.7 billion in monthly expenditure, and an intelligence architecture so vast it is beginning to collapse under its own weight. Into this churning operational environment, via a process so informal it barely qualifies as a deployment order, steps a 16-man Canadian reconnaissance patrol. 16 men, not a brigade, not a task force, not a battalion. 16 men with rifles, radios, and a doctrine built for a country that has spent 40 years perfecting the art of doing more with considerably less. The Americans do not want them there, at least not initially. As the phrase attributed to a senior U.S. officer at the time has since passed into the vernacular of Canadian Special Operations culture. Get those Canadian lunatics out. Delivered not in admiration, delivered in frustration. Delivered because what the Canadians were doing made no institutional sense to the people watching them do it. What happened next did not simply backfire. It rewrote, quietly and without ceremony, how a generation of coalition planners thought about reconnaissance, intelligence collection, and the relationship between scale and effect. This is that story. To understand the magnitude of what unfolds in Iraq in 2003, you need to understand what Joint Task Force 2 actually is, and more importantly, what it is not. JTF-2, Joint Task Force 2, is Canada's Tier 1 Special Operations Unit. It was established formally in April 1993, absorbing the counter-terrorism mandate previously held by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Special Emergency Response Team. Its headquarters sits at Dwyer Hill, Ontario, approximately 40 kilometers southwest of Ottawa, on a patch of unremarkable Canadian shield terrain that gives nothing away from the outside about what happens inside. Visitor access is non-existent. Published unit strength figures are deliberately withheld by the Canadian government. Estimates from credible defense analysts place the unit's operational element at somewhere between 300 and 600 personnel, though the true number is classified at a level that even Allied intelligence services receive only on a need-to-know basis. What is known publicly, because its operational record makes concealment functionally impossible, is that JTF-2 is one of the most rigorously selected and comprehensively trained special operations forces on Earth. The selection process runs approximately 3 weeks of initial assessment, followed by a training pipeline that takes successful candidates between 18 months and 2 years before they are considered operationally deployable at the Tier 1 level. Attrition during selection consistently exceeds 80%. These are not anomalous figures. They are standard for Tier 1 units globally. What distinguishes JTF-2 is less the selection rate and more the particular emphasis the unit places on what Canadian military doctrine calls small team survivability in denied environments. The language is bureaucratic. The reality it describes is not. A denied environment, in operational terms, is a space where you cannot be extracted quickly when things go wrong, where the enemy has home advantage, local knowledge, and no legal constraints on what they will do if they find you, where your margin for error in movement, concealment, communications, and decision-making is measured not in percentages, but in fractions. JTF-2 operators train specifically for this environment, not as a secondary capability, as the primary reason the unit exists. Canada's particular contribution to Western special operations thinking runs through this single concept with unusual consistency. A nation of 37 million people with a defense budget that reached only 24.3 billion Canadian dollars in 2023, roughly 1.4% of GDP and a fraction of what the United States spends before breakfast, has never been in a position to out-resource an adversary. The Canadian military culture, operating for decades inside NATO's collective framework, but always conscious of its own logistical and budgetary ceiling, developed something more durable than equipment abundance. It developed the ability to extract disproportionate effect from minimal physical presence. This doctrine does not have a single clean name. It lives in the training syllabuses, the selection philosophy, and the institutional memory of units like JTF-2 and the Canadian Special Operations Regiment. But its practical expression is consistent across theaters and decades. Put the smallest possible number of the most capable possible people in the most sensitive possible place, and let their information shape decisions that armies of thousands cannot make for themselves. In 2001, after 9/11, were JTF-2 deployed to Afghanistan as part of Operation Apollo. What they did there is still largely classified. What has been confirmed through official Canadian government acknowledgement, parliamentary testimony, and investigative reporting by outlets including the Globe and Mail and National Post is that they operated alongside American and British forces in conditions that earned them a United States Navy Presidential Unit citation in 2002. The citation, awarded by the U.S. government for extraordinary heroism, is one of the very few instances of a foreign unit receiving that particular honor. The citation itself remains partially classified. By the time 2003 arrives and the focus shifts to Iraq, JTF-2 has an established relationship with U.S. Special Operations Command that functions on two simultaneous levels: official skepticism and operational respect. The official position of the Canadian government, following Prime Minister Jean Chrétien's decision not to join the Iraq coalition, is that Canada is not participating in combat operations in Iraq. The operational reality, filtered through intelligence sharing agreements, liaison arrangements, and the kind of quiet bilateral cooperation that exists between Canada and the United States at a level immune to political weather, is considerably more complicated. 16 men cross into that complication in 2003. They do so carrying approximately 40 kilograms of equipment per operator. They carry no press releases, no political protection, and no formal authorization that would survive a journalist's freedom of information request. They carry, instead, a reconnaissance doctrine refined over 40 years and an institutional willingness to operate in conditions their American counterparts had significantly more institutional support to avoid. The U.S. military in Iraq in 2003 is not struggling because it lacks resources. The opposite problem is closer to the truth. At peak operational tempo, in the months following the fall of Baghdad, coalition forces in theater are supported by an intelligence apparatus that includes satellites covering a combined ground track of over 10,000 kilometers per day, Predator unmanned aerial vehicles logging thousands of flight hours monthly, signals intelligence platforms that can monitor a city block worth of communications simultaneously, and human intelligence networks being rapidly built from zero at enormous cost. The National Security Agency alone is processing a volume of intercepted communications so large that analysts are drowning. The information exists. The problem is that it cannot be converted into action fast enough because the distance between the sensor and the human interpreter is measured in thousands of miles and bureaucratic layers. This is the fundamental structural problem of big war intelligence. scale creates its own form of blindness. A senior intelligence analyst at CENTCOM, quoted in Linda Robinson's 2008 study, "Tell Me How This Ends," described the situation with unusual candor. "We had more information than we could process. The problem wasn't collection. The problem was that nobody was actually watching anything. We were just recording it." The insurgency forming in central Iraq in mid-2003 does not have this problem. It operates in small cells, uses couriers for sensitive communications, avoids patterns, and exploits the coalition's institutional reliance on technical collection by doing its most sensitive coordination in ways that leave no electronic signature. It is, in essence, a low-technology insurgency, winning an intelligence war against a high-technology opponent. Not because the technology fails, but because the technology was designed to fight a different kind of conflict. Into this asymmetry, the 16-man Canadian element deploys not as a solution the Americans designed, but as a capability that exists in a conceptual register. The American system, at that moment, has difficulty processing. Like what JTF-2 brings to the fight is human pattern recognition conducted at ground level, in sustained close proximity to the operational environment, over extended periods without resupply or extraction. In doctrinal terms, this is long-range reconnaissance patrol work elevated to a strategic intelligence function. In practical terms, it means operators living in hides, in vehicles, in positions for days at a time, watching specific locations, tracking specific individuals, mapping the social geography of a neighborhood, rather than its physical geography. The distinction matters enormously. Satellite imagery can tell you that a vehicle is parked outside a building at 02:14 hours on a Tuesday. It cannot tell you whether the man who climbs out of that vehicle does so with the careful deliberateness of someone who has conducted counter-surveillance, or with the casual movement of a man who has done this 100 times and trusts the route. That distinction, behavioral, contextual, interpretive, requires a trained human being within visual range. It requires, at minimum, a pair of eyes that understand what normal looks like before they can identify what abnormal means. JTF-2 operators are trained to acquire and hold that contextual baseline. The training package includes not just surveillance technique, but the broader framework of environmental integration, understanding how people in a given neighborhood move, what their relationship to time and space looks like, what a man who knows he is being watched looks like versus a man who doesn't. This is not exotic knowledge. It is taught in every serious reconnaissance program globally. What distinguishes JTF-2's approach is the duration they are trained to sustain it and the size of the team required to do so. 16 men, organized into small reconnaissance elements, likely pairs or 4-man teams depending on the requirement, operating with a command node that can be as small as a single officer and a communications suite. The communications suite deserves a moment's attention. By 2003, Canadian Special Operations Forces are equipped with encrypted satellite communication systems capable of transmitting compressed intelligence packages, imagery, voice, text, to higher headquarters in near real time. Now, the total weight of a team's communications package is approximately 8 to 12 kilograms, depending on configuration. The bandwidth is modest by American standards. The security architecture is not. Canada's SIGINT relationship with the United States, formalized through the Five Eyes Agreement, means that data passed by Canadian operators in theater can flow directly into American analytical systems without translation delays or classification barriers. The pipeline exists. Using it requires only a team small enough and skilled enough to generate the input. The initial American reaction to the Canadian presence is, by multiple accounts, one of baffled condescension. The unit arriving does not look like what the Americans expect a special operations element to look like. They travel light, and their kit is functional rather than modular. Fewer rail-mounted accessories, less body armor than American counterparts operating in higher tempo direct action roles, because long-range reconnaissance doctrine trades protection weight for mobility and endurance. An American Tier 1 operator in 2003 Iraq is commonly carrying 27 to 32 kilograms of body armor, weapons, and mission-specific kit for a direct action raid. An operator configured for extended ground reconnaissance in the same theater might carry 38 to 42 kilograms total, but distributed differently, weighted toward sustainment, communications, and optics rather than assault capability. The Canadians look to American eyes underprepared. The phrase "get those Canadian lunatics out" reportedly originates in this period of initial friction, is attributed to a senior American officer observing an operation that produced results without the force posture the American system had trained itself to associate with credible operations. The precise source is disputed. Multiple JTF-2 veterans and Canadian defense journalists have referenced it in interviews. It has been cited in parliamentary committee testimony in Ottawa, indirectly and without specific attribution. Whether it was said exactly as reported is less important than what it represents: institutional skepticism toward a capability that does not fit the expected template. That skepticism begins its reversal within days. The intelligence the Canadian element begins producing in their first operational week is, by the accounts of American intelligence officers who reviewed it, is qualitatively different from what the existing collection architecture is generating. Not necessarily more voluminous, more specific. Named individuals, confirmed movement patterns, social network mappings accurate enough to be cross-referenced against existing human intelligence product and yield new leads. The source of this quality is not technology. It is time and proximity. Sustained human observation, conducted over sufficient duration to distinguish pattern from noise. By the end of the first 10 days, the Canadian reconnaissance product is being integrated directly into targeting cycles at the American Task Force headquarters. By day 19, senior American officers are making a very different kind of call. Not get them out, but we need more of them. The irony is architectural. The United States had built the most technically sophisticated intelligence collection apparatus in the history of warfare, and the gap it could not fill was being filled by 16 Canadians with optical equipment, encrypted radios, and a doctrine built on the institutional acceptance of discomfort. This is not a coincidence. It is the logical consequence of decades of resource-constrained operational thinking, meeting a problem that resource abundance had, paradoxically, made worse. Consider the specific operational context the Canadian element was working in during this period. The terrain is predominantly urban and peri-urban, the sprawling, poorly mapped transitional zones between Iraq's major population centers and the agricultural flatlands beyond. Visibility ranges in the urban zones run from 50 to 300 meters, depending on street width and building density. Ambient noise levels make electronic surveillance of specific targets at close range extremely difficult without physical proximity. Vehicle-based observation is possible but generates pattern-of-life signatures that a trained observer can detect within 24 to 48 hours. The optimal collection method in this environment is a trained human being who can change their observable profile, their movement pattern, their vehicle if using one, their entry and exit points, frequently enough to avoid becoming part of the background in a way that registers to hostile counter-surveillance. JTF-2's doctrine specifically addresses this. It's the concept of minimal signature persistent observation, not an officially published Canadian doctrine term, but a fair summary of what multiple sources describe, is built around the idea that a small team, properly trained, can maintain surveillance of a high-value target for longer and at lower risk of compromise than a larger, more heavily resourced element, precisely because they have less to hide. 2 men in a suitable vehicle, with appropriate cover, with the training to manage their behavioral signature, are harder to identify as surveillance than a team of 12 in armored vehicles with crew-served weapons. The protection differential is real. The intelligence collection advantage of the smaller team in this specific environment more than compensates for it. American commanders, once they understood what they were looking at, began to understand something that defense budget allocation had been obscuring for years. The $11 billion spent on satellite reconnaissance assets, the $2.3 billion annual budget of the National Reconnaissance Office, the entire sprawling enterprise of technical collection, none of it could replicate what a trained human being with binoculars and 8 hours of patience could produce. Not because the technology was inferior in absolute terms, because the problem it was being asked to solve required a different kind of instrument entirely. The Canadians were that instrument. And they had arrived, as Canada so often does in coalition operations, quiet, uninvited, and quietly essential. While there is a moment, documented in fragments across multiple sources including Canadian parliamentary testimony, journalist Murray Brewster's reporting for the Canadian Press, and the subsequent institutional review that took place within Canadian Forces headquarters in 2004, that crystallizes everything this deployment represents. Day 14, a specific urban district in central Iraq, the precise location remaining classified. 2 operators in a static observation position, a rooftop hide established 48 hours earlier, watching a building they have been tracking for 6 days. The building has hosted, in that 6-day period, a pattern of activity that their intelligence database suggests is consistent with a courier node, a point through which information, cache, or personnel passes between cells without any of those cells needing to know each other's composition or location. This is the structural genius of a decentralized insurgency, and the hardest problem set for any intelligence collection system to crack, because the courier himself may not know what he is carrying or who sent it. The operators have approximately 400 meters of direct sight line to the building's main entrance. They have been in position for 4 hours and 17 minutes when the movement begins. A vehicle they have not seen before, different plates, driver behavior, the slight over-deliberateness of someone who has been trained to check mirrors at specific intervals, consistent with surveillance consciousness. The vehicle pauses at a position 80 meters north of the building for 93 seconds, pulls forward, parks with the nose facing out. A man exits carrying nothing, enters the building. None of this is on any satellite image. None of it would have been captured by a UAV circling at 5,000 meters, because the behavioral indicators, the mirror check, the positioning of the vehicle, the direction it faces, are invisible at that altitude. They are visible to a trained human being at ground level, who has been watching this specific location long enough to know what arrival looks like when someone does not want to be remembered arriving. 22 minutes later, the man leaves, different direction. He does not return to the vehicle, continues on foot, turning into a side street 130 meters to the east, moving at the pace of someone with time to spare, which is itself a surveillance indicator. The intelligence package, compressed, encrypted, transmitted via satellite link within 4 minutes of the observation, lands at American Task Force headquarters at 13:47 local time. It is cross-referenced within 6 hours against existing HUMINT product. By 2100, a targeting meeting is underway. By 0300 the following morning, an American direct action element is briefing against a second location. Not the original building the Canadians had been watching, but a location identified through the cross-reference 3 streets away that the original intelligence package had made visible. That raid produces 3 detainees and a cache of documents. The documents produce, when fully exploited, 11 further intelligence leads. 3 of those leads are still generating product 6 months later. This is what 19 days looks like when the instrument matches the problem. No, but here is what the record also shows. Those two operators on that rooftop on day 14 had been awake for 31 hours. They were operating on individual sustainment rations, approximately 2,400 calories each, insufficient for the physical demands of sustained operational activity, and had access to 4 liters of water per operator for the duration of the hide. The temperature inside a rooftop position in central Iraq in summer exceeds 47 degrees Celsius by mid-afternoon. Body armor is not worn during static observation because the heat signature and the mobility restriction both become mission liabilities. The risk of compromise is managed through concealment and behavioral discipline rather than ballistic protection. They are, by any institutional measure, in a highly dangerous position with minimal support infrastructure. The American Direct Action Team that acted on their intelligence that night left their base in 4 vehicles, carrying a combined approximately 960 kilograms of equipment and personnel. They had close air support on station. They had an extraction plan and a medical support package. They had, in every tangible sense, every resource advantage. The intelligence that made their raid possible was produced by 2 men in sandals on a rooftop with a set of binoculars, an encrypted radio, and the institutional willingness to stay uncomfortable for longer than their American counterparts had been trained to accept. When the American commander at the task force headquarters, according to accounts relayed in a 2006 internal Canadian Forces review cited in academic work by Dr. Sean Maloney of the Royal Military College of Canada, was briefed on the source of the intelligence that had led to the raid, he was reportedly silent for a moment before saying something approximating. "How many of them are there?" 16. Another silence. The phrase "get those Canadian lunatics out" does not appear in any record from this point forward. What appears instead, in the documentary trail that follows, is a series of requests from American Task Force headquarters for the Canadian element to extend their operational tasking, to expand their area of operations, and eventually to share their methodology in a more structured format with American reconnaissance elements who were being reconsidered against the same doctrinal problems the Canadians had just solved empirically. 19 days. That number, which opened this account as an exercise in cognitive dissonance, reveals its full weight only now. In 19 days, a 16-man element with an annual equipment and sustainment, cost that does not appear anywhere in any publicly accessible budget document, because it is classified in its operational specifics, but which conservative modeling suggests runs to perhaps 8 to 12 million Canadian dollars per year for the full unit, a figure dwarfed by the cost of a single U.S. Predator UAV at approximately $20 million US dollars, produced intelligence that redirected the targeting priorities of a multi-billion-dollar coalition enterprise. The lesson the Americans took from this is not simple. It would be convenient, and wrong, to present it as a straightforward vindication of small team over large force or low budget over high budget, whereas that framing misses the point in a way that is itself instructive. The $20 million Predator and the $11 billion satellite constellation were not made redundant by 16 Canadians. They were made complete by them. Technical collection and human observation are not competing doctrines. They are complementary instruments that produce categorically different types of intelligence, and the coalition in 2003 had built an intelligence architecture that was overwhelmingly weighted toward one and had systematically underdeveloped the other. The Canadian element's contribution was not to outperform American intelligence. It was to fill the specific gap that American intelligence, for structural and resource reasons, had left open. The gap between the pixel and the person, between the intercept and the interpretation, or between information and understanding. This distinction between information and understanding becomes one of the central intellectual preoccupations of U.S. Special Operations reform in the years following 2003. General Stanley McChrystal, writing in Team of Teams about the operational and intelligence transformation he led at JSOC during the same period, frames the problem with characteristic directness. We had to abandon the pursuit of an efficient, tightly supervised machine and accept the fact that we had to become something else entirely. The Canadian element, without reading McChrystal's later analysis, had already operationalized its conclusion. The institutional irony runs deeper still. Canada's decision not to join the Iraq coalition, a decision that was politically contentious, diplomatically costly, and publicly debated at a volume that now seems disproportionate to its practical consequences, did not prevent Canadian Special Operations Forces from contributing to the coalition's intelligence effort. It simply ensured they did so without the bureaucratic overhead, command layer complications, and force protection requirements that formal coalition membership would have imposed. The 16 men operated with a freedom of action that a formal coalition unit in the same theater would not have had. The political absence created an operational advantage. This is a point that no one in Ottawa was making publicly at the time, for reasons that require no explanation. The longer-term consequences of the Iraq deployment for JTF-2 and for Canadian Special Operations more broadly are traceable in the institutional record. Whilst the Canadian Special Operations Forces Command, CANSOFCOM, was formally established in February 2006, creating for the first time a unified command structure for JTF-2, the Canadian Special Operations Regiment, 427 Special Operations Aviation Squadron, and CSOR's supporting elements. The budget allocated to CANSOFCOM at establishment was approximately 200 million Canadian dollars over 5 years for capital projects alone. This is a direct institutional consequence of what the Iraq and Afghanistan deployments demonstrated: that the capability existed, that the returns justified the investment, and that the command structure needed to match the operational ambition. The specific methodology that the Canadian element demonstrated in Iraq, the sustained human ground reconnaissance model, the small team intelligence production architecture, is now formalized in Canadian Special Operations doctrine in a form that, while classified in its specifics, is publicly acknowledged to be a core competency of CANSOFCOM's operational element. It is trained to, it is exercised against, it is budgeted for. The Americans, for their part, arrived at similar conclusions through parallel processes. The growth of Army Ranger-affiliated reconnaissance capabilities, the expansion of intelligence support activity operations, and the doctrinal evolution visible in JSOC's operational record from 2004 onward all point toward the same destination the Canadians had already reached: that in certain environments, at certain phases of a conflict, now the most strategically valuable capability you can deploy is a small number of exceptionally trained human observers with the endurance to stay in place and the training to understand what they are seeing. 19 days and 16 men had demonstrated something that $40 billion in annual intelligence spending had, briefly, obscured. That quantity and quality are not the same thing. That scale and effect are not synonymous. That the instrument which fits the problem will always outperform the instrument which dominates the budget. And there is one further dimension to this story that the operational record doesn't fully capture, but that the human record does. Those operators came home. Not all special operations deployments produce this outcome, but these did. Now they returned to Dwyer Hill carrying an operational experience that became curriculum, refined, assessed, passed forward to the next generation of candidates who would survive selection, survive training, and eventually find themselves in positions not unlike a rooftop in central Iraq, watching a building that no satellite can read, waiting with the stillness of men who understand that patience is a weapons system. The investment Canada made in those 16 men, the years of selection, the training pipeline, the institutional culture that shaped their doctrine, did not begin in 2003. It began in 1993 when JTF2 was formed, in a thought process that preceded that by a decade. In a Canadian military philosophy that has been consistent since the operational lessons of the Korean War, embedded themselves in how Canada thinks about what small numbers of highly trained soldiers can achieve when placed in exactly the right position. The phrase "get those Canadian lunatics out" was delivered as a dismissal. History received it as a compliment. There is a version of this story that ends in triumph. 16 heroes, a grateful superpower, a mission accomplished, flags, and ceremony. That version is available. It is also incomplete in the way that all simple endings are incomplete when the subject is war. The complete version includes the 48 hours without sleep, the 47-degree heat on a rooftop with no shade, the 4 liters of water, as the sustained psychological weight of knowing that a single compromised position means no extraction is coming fast enough to matter. It includes the operators who did this across multiple deployments, not once, and who carry the accumulated cost of sustained high-tempo operations in the way that all Tier 1 operators carry it, invisibly, institutionally, over years. The complete version also includes the unanswerable question that sits beneath every story about the relationship between scale and effect in modern warfare. If 16 men operating for 19 days could produce intelligence that redirected a coalition's targeting priorities, what does that tell you about the 19 years of conflict that followed? About the hundreds of thousands of personnel, the trillions of dollars, now the institutional machinery that kept expanding long after the problem it was designed to solve had changed its shape. The most expensive intelligence system in human history and the most effective intelligence asset in a specific theater of operations in 2003 were not in competition. They were in the same chain of events. But one of them was worth $20 million, and the other was worth 16 phone calls to Dwyer Hill. You can spend 40 years and $4 billion building the most sophisticated collection apparatus ever conceived. And somewhere, in a theater you didn't plan for, the capability that changes the outcome will arrive on foot, travel light, ask for nothing, and watch quietly from a rooftop while the machinery figures out what it's looking at. The lunatics are always the ones who understand the problem first.